challenged as we try to implement new technologies that take up significantly more land. And so I wanted to dive a bit into those constraints. I will say, like many of you, I think the new policy context has sort of thrown me for a loop, and I'm not sure exactly where this fits in it any longer. But we can talk about that together, perhaps. Okay, so likely not a surprise to folks in this room that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is crucial to mitigating the worst of climate change, right, to protecting our populations, and also to having a meaningful chance to adapt to climate changes too. And the largest sectoral contributor to these emissions is the energy production sector, and within the energy production sector, the largest contributor is electricity production consumption. And so while I'm broadly interested in questions of energy consumption, and that's where I would like to go following this, I thought a nice place to start would be with a simpler question, just looking at electricity consumption rates. I think we can skip that, you know, that the big challenges involved. So to address a lot of these challenges, we've had folks like Pakala and Sokolow put forward these models of wedges, sectoral wedges in particular. The argument is that, like I just suggested, we can look at a particular sector of the economy and see how much total carbon dioxide emissions it accounts for, and then remove that wedge to drop our total carbon dioxide contributions to the atmosphere. In 2009, some scholars and collaborators at one point of mine put forward a paper about the behavioral wedge rather than the sectoral wedge. And the behavioral wedge was meant to point out that there's massive opportunity to draw down carbon dioxide emissions by encouraging behavioral change. Specifically, drawing down carbon dioxide emissions has the opportunity to be the equivalent of turning France off every year, right? So as they say, reasonably achievable emissions reduction can be approximately 20% in the household sector within 10 years if the most effective non-regulatory interventions are used. This amounts to 123 megatons of carbon a year, or 7.4% of total national emissions, an amount slightly larger than the national emissions of France. So a meaningful intervention. Sometime later in 2021, they, with a newer graduate, a wonderful graduate named Mariah Caballero, published a new paper, again affirming this and finding that, in fact, 12% of climate and energy funds that the IRA have invested in, and 4.3 billion or 5.7% of clean energy power funds in the IIJA target voluntary household actions. And these can contribute to 40% of cumulative emissions reductions if we just assume a middle range scenario pathway. And if we assume an optimistic scenario, then we're looking at over 60%. At the same time, people like J.B. Rule and James Salzman have pointed to the extreme difficulty of deploying infrastructures that can facilitate some of these changes. Sometimes these infrastructures are the type we think of when we talk about infrastructures, and sometimes it's more heat pumps, right? Or how is it that we update our buildings? And specifically what they were addressing is the long wait time for actually getting building projects done in the United States. And they had an important insight in this paper where they said to meet even a middle road renewable energy scenario would require bringing online 2 new 400 megawatt solar power facilities, each taking up at least 2,000 acres of land every week for the next 30 years. And I was pretty struck by that. I kind of wondered, how much land do we have to give up every week for the next 30 years? The answer is a lot, by the way, but it all depends on how you look at it. But we can talk about that more. At the same time, many people are pointing to technological efficiencies, or improvements in technological efficiencies as a way to get around that difficulty that I just discussed, right? So folks like Van Zalk and Berims have suggested that, or found really, that solar has increased by 0.42 electric watts per square meter a year on average. So this is a measure of power density, watts per square meter, right? Where we're talking about how much power or how much energy flux can flow through a particular area. And every technology has a cap on how much flux it can pass, right? So in theory, solar is capped by the insolation rate of the Earth, how much sunlight actually comes in, and we can never really surpass that with technological advancement. So we can think of that kind of as an absolute cap on how much consumption we can have if we want to have renewable infrastructure supporting that consumption in the future. Right now, we're very far away from that cap. Wind is not improving, but it is something that people are excited about as well. So we see trends towards improvement in wind in terms of power density, but largely this is because of their expansiveness, right? And the fact that wind, though it takes up a rather large amount of space, wind turbines, we can still use the space underneath them. So there are actually debates about how it is we count the power density of wind for this reason. And in fact, there are ambiguities like this throughout the field, or the study of power density. I wouldn't say it's a field at this point yet. And this makes it rather difficult to find a way forward in the research. Just to illustrate some of these challenges in terms of space, right? Van Zock and Burns again show us that in 2018, to support just the United States, we had to occupy land area about the size of half of California. Right? So not insignificant, but something that is manageable in the long run. If we were to look forward, into the future, and turn to 80% renewables, then we're talking about taking up a much more sizable area of land. So we can look at this energy mixture that they hypothesized here at 2050 and see that this would require an additional 15 million hectares of land being dedicated to electricity production and consumption in the United States. And of course, like all things, these decisions don't fall equally across populations. So even within the United States, there are dramatic regional differences, largely having to do with climate and geography of who would be most impacted by this. And for those of us who study environmental inequality and justice, I was struck by the fact that the South sees its land requirements almost tripled throughout the period that we're looking at, if this was to take place. And of course, this is to subsidize the energy or electricity consumption habits of the rest of the nation in part. So we have only 30% of global surface area to play with in this way, right? And some nations, like the United States, have quite a lot of land space, right? We can say that 29 nations occupy 17.65% of global surface area. So this leaves just over 12% left for the other 166 nations to try to manage their electricity consumption requirements. If we're going to be energy independent nations, as many people say we should, and as given the nature of energetics and electricity production and consumption, it would make sense if we want to do a renewable infrastructure approach. So following here, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking through some basic questions in the area of power density and see what kinds of limitations are placed on the technologies that we have in front of us, what these limitations suggest about inequality, and what maybe we can do next. And I'll turn to you all for some of that. So a little more nitty gritty, I'm going to walk us through largely descriptive statistics of global trends in power density of electricity consumption specifically. And I call this electric power demand, just to make it a little bit simpler. Then I'll turn to exploration of land use requirements of electric power electric power demand given the average power density of available technologies. And from there, I'll turn to considerations of how changes in electric power demand over time impact people differentially using a new measure called electric power demand per capita. Lastly, I'm sorry, using this, I have a fairly simple kind of toy regression model to think about how social processes impact this power demand per capita. And so just to give you a sense of the variables that I'm working with here, I'm drawing everything for the most part from the World Bank's World Development Indicators, leaning mostly on electric consumption per capita, total population, total land area, age dependency, or the age dependency ratio, the proportion of the population that is working relative to the rest of the population. Urban population, manufacturing as a percentage of GDP or value added, and GDP per capita in 2015, constant US dollars. I'm using power density estimates drawn from both Václav Smil, who's one of the first to introduce or popularize the concept of power density, and Van Zok and Burns, who have put forward the most recent estimates of the power density of electricity production technologies. And finally, I use the World Bank Development Indicators to construct 3 variables. One is total electricity consumption, just measured in kilowatt hours, power density measured in watts per square meter. And so because power density is averaged over the year, this is the average power density of electricity consumption in the United States over that time. And then electric power demand per capita, which is I guess, kind of a heady measure, but it's watts per square meter per person. And this, I reason, will be particularly useful for trying to understand inequality dynamics and also changes in consumption over time, because it takes into account changes in population as well as how much of the watts per land area that are available are being consumed by that population. So in theory, if this ratio increases, that should be telling us that people are consuming more or that technologies are declining for some reason in their efficiency. And if it decreases, we're told the opposite, right? That people are consuming less or that technologies are becoming more efficient. So first, we'll just take a look at total global electricity consumption between 1995 and 2014 here. And you can see, sorry, this is quite small, but it's consistently rising throughout this period. And this is something that I found in other aspects of my work related to infrastructural displacement. So how is it that the introduction of a new infrastructural technology does or does not cause another one to be used less often? It's almost never used less often, and this is reflected here, right? That we always find new uses for the technologies that we have, and we continually drive up electricity consumption as we do. So you can see here that that in 2014, we passed the 20,000 terawatt mark as a global community in just our electricity consumption, which is in some ways a magnificent achievement. We can compare this to power density, and you see the measure is much smaller, but the trend continues in the same direction. So here what we see is we have, by the end of the period we're looking at in 2014, about 0.025 watts per square meter of power being required to support electricity consumption habits in the United States. So my first question, like I said, was, how realistic is it for us to support these using green technologies? And I almost never have good news in these types of studies, but this is very good news. Whether we would only want to use solar or only want to use wind, we're very far away from pressing the spatial limits of these infrastructures, right, or these technologies right now. So what we see here is that wind has an average power density of 2.73 watts per square meter, and a minimum of 2.23 with a maximum of 3.23, while solar has a mean of 7.3 with a maximum of 8.2 and a minimum of 6.4. So this makes, relative to these power densities, our power demand seems as though it's zero. So the next thing I want to do is look regionally. In doing this, what we see is that there are, again, dramatic increases in consumption that are disproportionately spread across global regions, where sub-Saharan Africa has seen almost no increases in its electricity consumption in the period that we're looking at between 1895 and 2014, while East Asia has seen massive increases, and the United States has remained floating high on top, so its rate of increase has slowed. When we look at power density, we see similar trajectories here. But again, the scale is diminished greatly. So we see that there's almost no power density requirement to support sub-Saharan Africa here. While Asia's is growing continually, and at 0.025, they've begun to pass the power density that could be supported by some woody biomass, like wood chips or rapeseed oil. United States passed that long ago. But other than biomasses, solar energy production or electricity production and wind turbine electricity production are more than adequate for supporting these power densities. So breaking down a bit more, I wanted to see what nations were actually responsible or leading, I guess I should say, in terms of power density over time. And on average, what we see is that smaller nations like Singapore, Hong Kong, Gibraltar, and Malta, who are constrained in their land area, are the ones that end up being most pressed in terms of their power density in the long run. Again, this is not actually a concern given the fact that solar has progressed so quickly over the last several years and its power densities have grown quite large. Now, if we look at mass consumption, we get a different maximum consumption of energy, we get a different picture. And this is probably not surprising given what we know about socio-environmental relationships in the global context, where China, the United States, Japan, India, the Russian Federation, and Germany are leading these dynamics. And of course, this has a lot to do with the land area that they have access to, as well as the population base that they support with that. So this is a plot regionally of this new measure that I discussed earlier, the power density or the electric power demand, I guess, of electric consumption globally. And so what we see here is that per person, right, the scale gets very small, but the United States is far and away leading the world in electricity consumption requirements. Followed far and away after that by Latin America, and then after that, East Asia. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to explore also some of the social drivers of these processes. And to do that, I went ahead and put together a small model. I'll run us through these descriptive statistics first. All of these are logged, and in some ways I kind of regret logging them, but what you see if you are familiar with the log scales is that most of these are massively skewed distributions. Again, just representing some of the inequalities in these spaces, particularly around electricity consumption and power density requirements. Okay, so to look at the social drivers of electric power demand, I'm doing a small, just two-level hierarchical model embedding nation years into nation states to account for disruptions to the global energy supply or to geopolitical strife that might trouble a specific country for some reason or another. And then, well, I think if you have questions about the model, I'm happy to talk about it. But I feel like it's fairly straightforward. So what we find, I think these are actually pretty interesting results, is that we can just go over to the full model. And we see that time is actually associated with an increase in the electric power demand of the population. So again, we're kind of running against the clock here because we do have absolute limits to what it is that we can do. GDP per capita is also a positive driver of this. And in the full model, a somewhat sizable one. These are, I forgot to mention, these are elasticities. So this is suggesting that a 1% increase in GDP per capita is associated with a 0.071% increase in electric power demand at the national level. Simultaneously, what we see, and this fits, I think, nicely with a lot of our, or at least with my intuitions about these processes, is that the percent of urban population is driving this down as it increases. So going to the end of the model, a 1% increase, final one, with a 1% increase in urban population percent is associated with a 0.2% decrease in electric power demand. So actually a pretty meaningful decline. And we see that all of these are significant here. And one thing that I'll point out too is that our ICCs suggest that the majority of the variation here, despite time mattering, is not happening over time, but is happening at that second level. So it's rather than being between, within a nation over time, it's between nations. Okay, and here's a visual representation of that. That's a bit easier to look at. And already I'm to the conclusions. So like I said, I was hoping I could mostly talk to you all about this and hear questions that you have. But some of the conclusions from this are that power density probably offers a useful tool for inquiries in environmental and climate sociology. Specifically because it gives us a very coherent way to think about changes in consumption relative to technological increases in efficiency. And this is one of the biggest challenges that environmental sociology has been confronted with historically, is how to account for technological change over time when we're trying to understand shifts in environmental dynamics. We can also see that all renewable technologies are adequate for meeting both global and regional power demand, which, like I said, is actually wonderful news, although it feels like it's poorly timed news in some ways. We can see too that the broad trajectory of the interplay between behavior and technology can be revealed by thinking about the way these ratios move with one another over time. And finally, while growth in GDP intensifies electric power demand per person, urbanization clearly alleviates it. And so there's some countervailing tendencies that are popping up that are characteristic of modernization and development more generally. So next steps, or places that I would like to go with this, are first, exploring relationships, considering constraints on the use of space. So rather than just looking at total space, which is rather coarse, I'd like to look at the difference or the trade-offs between, say, the use of arable land to calculate power density and electric power demand relative to urban land area, for instance. And also being more mindful of the fact that, say, mountainous slopes are not adequate for generating power in most circumstances. In addition to that, I'd like to examine the difference between the use of power density to meet electricity demand versus energy demand over time, and to ultimately explore scenarios of how population growth and consumption habit changes can alter pressures on land use change and land availability for electric infrastructure systems. So thank you. I know that was rather quick, but I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
I'm just going to run the mic back and forth for folks online.
Thanks, this is super interesting. You said it makes sense that increased urbanization decreases I can make some guesses at that. Could you tell us one? Because you're better than Mark.
Yeah. So the reason that, well, decreases.
Maddie, does that thing work for him to speak into? Does he need to speak into this mic?
No, the online mic.
Will work? Okay.
Okay. So the question was, why might I say that it would make sense that an increase in urbanization or the proportion of the population living in urban areas might lead to a decline in electric power demand? Maybe I was speaking a little hastily, actually, because there is a bit of a back and forth over the impact of urban growth on, say, efficiency and energy use, right? Where some people suggest that the process of densification itself ends up reducing energy and electricity consumption in the long run. But other people point out that as we urbanize, we actually, which I suppose is why it's worthwhile to keep it in the model, as we urbanize, we actually end up speeding up our social interactions and consuming more over time. We do more when we live in cities than when we live elsewhere. That said, most people's intuitions is that, which is why I said this, is that cities tend to be good for the environment. And that's something that we saw reflected here, right? Is that urbanizing makes it easier for us to deploy, or it gives us more, I guess, land area to deploy our electricity infrastructures on.
Yeah, so this is a great talk, and I just wanted to ask you about trying to incorporate information about things like mountainous areas that might not be available for energy production, probably areas that are also just very difficult to build, like an electrical grid, right, to transport, right? So I think those kind of physical barriers to take into consideration are really interesting. I want to hear your thoughts, though, about trying to incorporate information about social and political barriers to the use of different kinds of money. So, for example, if you have a plot of land in Washington, in eastern Washington, the political barriers to utilizing that land might be different than in the middle of Wyoming, for example, or land that's adjacent to a native population. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about our prospects for incorporating those kinds of social and political barriers.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really wonderful, okay. I'm okay to repeat it into here. So the question is, I think just what do I think generally about how we could potentially incorporate some of the political and the social or cultural dynamics that oftentimes make it difficult to actually build in the way that J.B. Rule was talking about, to deploy quickly infrastructures that might be beneficial in trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in the long run. From the perspective of incorporating that into a study, I'm not sure how I would go about doing it yet, especially at the global level. That's absolutely something that I would like to do, though. And certainly I'm aware of those dynamics, even aesthetics in terms of wind turbines, right, throughout a lot of the Sun Belt in the United States. And I think the bigger question maybe is, what do you do to confront those kinds of barriers, even if you're aware of them? And I hate to appeal to the political moment too much, but I feel a bit at sea for answering that, I guess. I suppose a great way to actually approach incorporating that information would be to change this study pretty dramatically, or at least the way I've been thinking about it, and to incorporate a much more on the ground qualitative component where I'm actually observing infrastructure that's attempting to be deployed or built out in one of these spaces, and trying to then determine how it is that these cultural barriers end up popping up, say, in the policy process for actually completing it. I'm not sure how I would go about at this. I have to think about that more, how I might quantify those sorts of processes. Yeah, but I would say if I would like to one day be able to incorporate something like that, I would think that it would be sort of an addition to this study. Yeah.
Thanks, Patrick. That's great.
Thanks, Sarah.
And I'm also going to follow up on a couple of these questions too, because what was going through my head was just to a little bit of background, but there's definitely the resistance to having some parts of rural Midwest in particular, the extent to which they're going to allow solar to be set up in places as well, turbines, etc. But I was thinking just thinking about the grid, the way so I'm thinking about the US, I'm not thinking about any other place but the US. And I'm wondering about the electric grid, the possibilities for distributed systems that decouple sort of these high demanding large grids and localized grids to be within, I'm thinking about it in terms of political and social change. Like if you have a sense of your local grid and you can build it that's within that local grid. But also thinking about dual use, triple use, ways in which land might be. So farmers can have coexisting wind turbines. They also often have coexisting oil pumps in Wyoming. So how you've thought about that, like the possibilities of different kinds of energy production being coexistent with existing land use and environments.
Yeah, so that was really when I first started thinking about this project, the way that I was almost certain that I was going to go was sort of disaggregating into this, because actually there are power density estimates, say for urban areas, I should say for solar photovoltaics for urban areas as well as for centralized solar farms, and they're different. And in fact, the urban areas have better power density measures. And this is particularly in a space like Germany, moving us away from the United States, right, where they are, I should say, both putting solar panels on their roof and now hanging them off the side of their building as well. So this is absolutely true. And again, one of the difficulties that makes it tricky to study power density dynamics, but I think worthwhile too. Because as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, just briefly, right, like you discussed the power density of wind turbines just now, and the fact that farmers can continue to use their land, or ranchers can continue to use their land for grazing, even as they're producing energy. Because of that, there's widespread disagreement over what the power density of wind turbines should be. Right, and so the sort of the best we can do is measure, I guess, across the range of these estimates and try to sort of incorporate and then propagate that uncertainty. And that's the way that I would like to move. But as I said, this ended up being largely, at least in the frame that I'm looking at it right now, I think maybe as I disaggregate landforms, this might come back into the picture. It ended up largely being immaterial, because our power density of just electricity demand, I have a feeling this would be different if we were looking at overall energy use and energy demand, is so small that we don't have any issue, no matter what energy mixture we use, right? And we're orders and orders of magnitudes away from pressing the down for fossil fuels. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, super interesting, and I really enjoyed that. I wanted to ask a little bit more about your intention in incorporating the dependency ratio and how you're interpreting that, and also if we were thinking of that just in the power demand, or also the land use, and how that dependency ratio.
Yeah, that was mostly, that's a great question. So the question, by the way, I'm trying to remember to repeat, is why choose to incorporate an age dependency ratio, more or less, I think, right? And so there are many reasons, right? Like one, it's indicative of increased energy. So we could say like sectorally, we would expect more electricity use in a space where more people are actively at work. But two, people consume energy or electricity as individuals, electricity differently throughout the life course, right? And when we're working age, up to about 60 is kind of when we're in peak consumption mode. And then we start to slow down after we've revved up from being kids and not really caring about devices or technologies and such. So for both those reasons, it doesn't necessarily bear on the land use dynamic. But I also acknowledge that it's come to be kind of a unexpected control in these sorts of like social drivers of environmental dynamic analyses. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for giving this talk. I think it was really interesting. I think the piece about usable wind area was particularly interesting as well. I was wondering if and how offshore energy production plays into that, particularly with offshore wind turbines.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does play into it, particularly in the Northeast. Offshore wind turbine deployment is a chief concern right now, and something that's being or has been invested in pretty robustly. That said, wind turbines, depending on where they are actually one of the technologies that kind of like can come close to not meeting global electricity demand. So that's not to say that like we can't just like throw them across the ocean and that would work, but it's also, there's feasibility issues associated with that too. And then one of the big things with this, which is why it makes sense to think about this at the national level when we start talking about renewable technologies, is transmission losses are significant in this space, right? So if we're trying to bring electricity way back from the ocean, that's just diminishing the low power density of wind turbines already. But they're good. Wind turbines are good. Say that too.
Thank you. This is very interesting. And I'm curious, going back to the topic of like behavioral change, the extent to which we can think about wind and solar being driven by policy decisions, say like at a state level, and the extent to which it can be just private, like farmers choosing to put a wind turbine on their property. I'm curious, I guess I don't have a sense of like what percent of power is coming from state or federal investment versus like private investment, and how that might change how we think about the behavioral images to try to improve how the adoption of these new technologies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. When you say private investment, do you mean like you said someone building a wind turbine themselves? Okay, I would say that's probably a fairly small share, except for in like distributed solar PVs, like Sarah mentioned earlier. And I guess what I would like to say in response to your question, I feel bad saying this, is that I don't know for sure in terms of like private investment dollars, what proportion comes from the federal government and what proportion comes from individuals. And that's something definitely worth looking into that I hadn't considered before. So thank you for the question. This maybe is a tangent, but I think it's worth noting that where there is capability for individuals to start up their own energy production enterprises of sorts, or communities to do this, like trying to do electric utility co-ops, for instance. I think a lot of people are pretty optimistic about the possibility of using virtual power plants, right, to try to escape some of the difficulties of, say, like peak electricity dynamics, where one area is experiencing peak electricity right when, say, the sun is going down, and another area, the sun is still shining bright, but everybody's at work. So we're not using that electricity at all. So how can we quickly package all that electricity that's being produced on these roofs together, and then probably algorithmically have a transmission system operator send it to reasonably close, reasonably profitable neighborhood? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting. I just have a question on behavior, but on the demand side of things, where I always thought that more advanced economies, they would adopt more electricity because of the technology and the ability to implement heat pumps for electric cars or things like that. But in your charts for electricity use, it didn't seem like we see some acceleration or adoption of demand for these advanced economies. Most of the acceleration is coming from East Asia and South Asia. And so I was wondering if you saw any evidence of, these changes to behavior and I guess these luxury products that these advanced economies have more access to.
So the question is whether or not I saw any evidence of maybe alternative economies getting access to luxury products that advanced economies have historically had access to. I would say no, not at the scale that I was looking at for this project here. But that's an interesting question. So the way that I was thinking about behavior mostly for this project, just to say that clearly, is that if we use power density, particularly power density of electricity or energy consumption, then we have a unique opportunity to say, like, this is the cap of what we're able to make given particular land area constraints and technological capacities. So once we find that cap, then we can say with certainty, given historical trajectories in electricity consumption, how people need to change their behaviors to come and meet these realities of the constraints on renewable infrastructures for electricity generation.
I guess my question is like that's like ex post, but ex ante, what we don't know yet is we have emerging technologies that might increase our electricity consumption way more than what we have in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that made me interested in looking at this, actually, is that we are in a bit of an energy scarcity moment for one of the first times in quite a while. But maybe if I push this forward 10 years, we'll see it in the data, but not quite yet.
I'll go ahead and ask a question. I'm so interested in how you approach this work as a sociologist. It seems like so many of your answers have to do with just almost the technical or engineering aspect of it. So when you were talking about Germany and having solar panels on the sides, or imagining Sarah's question about land use that's being used in two different ways. So how would one categorize it? So I guess the question that I'm building towards is, as a sociologist who's studying societies and people's behavior, what kinds of approaches does that bring to the study of this field that maybe folks who aren't sociologists wouldn't be thinking about? So essentially, what is it that an environmental sociologist has to offer this sort of conversation that I'm sure is very interdisciplinary? And then also, what are you learning from technical folks? Like when you gave the answer about algorithms bringing all of the energy together depending on when the sun is out and starting out. I mean, just so much technical information. So I'm just curious about the melding of those different aspects.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. I would say this is not a deeply interdisciplinary field. So maybe partially I'm trying to poke at making it one, right? Most power density studies are actually very small scale and focused on what the power density of, say, like a battery is. And like you say, or I think maybe like you're suggesting, there's important sociological aspects of these processes when we get to a larger scale than, say, like the power density of the battery that's going to power our car. But even that, I think it's important to note that all of these dynamics are deeply social, right? So when I talked about the solar panels on rooftops and on the sides of people's balconies in Germany, there's a social contagion dynamic to that, right? That's measurable, and we know that having someone put up solar panels in your neighborhood makes it more likely that you will. And this seems, I don't want to say universal because I'm a sociologist, but this seems pretty consistent across spaces, right? And the choice of what do we do with the extra land that's beneath wind turbines, right? Or how is it that we navigate international law to decide how far we can put turbines off the coast? All of these, I think, are deeply social questions, right? And bear on the constraints that we have in terms of our decision-making processes for what types of technologies ultimately we will use and how we'll deploy them, where and when, so on and so forth.
Okay.
All we need to do is here. His name is Tony Spelling.
You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Being in that cohort, that age cohort that no longer is the high demand cohort, and having been around in this area for almost 50 years working on energy stuff, I always find this very interesting, and I think what you're doing is quite important. I wanted to explore a little bit about what your thinking is on the demand side, and in particular, the emergence of new electrification technology. Talked about a little bit here from some of the questions, but I think we can make an argument, particularly for electric vehicles, that we're probably pretty low down on the logistical deployment curve on the adoption of electric vehicles, with some exceptions like Norway, or and maybe a little farther along with the exception of heat pumps. But it's likely that if people are successful in a major move towards electrification, we'll see some big increases in both of those. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about potentially incorporating that into your model, into your thinking, where we're in a different set of demands a decade or 2 decades from now.
That's a really great question. I'm not sure that I've gotten so far as to thinking about how I will incorporate people adopting electric cars, but what I would hope to do as a next step, and what I am envisioning as part of this study eventually, is considering how it is that different types of electricity supply have their own demand in various areas, right? So right now we're just kind of, or in this, what I showed with you, or shared with you today, excuse me, we just kind of abstractly threw all sorts of electricity into one bin together, right? And all sorts of consumption processes into one bin together. And I think it'd be worthwhile to say, well, what is the electric power demand for, say, solar PVs, right? Or for wind turbines, or for woody biomass. And then we can get a little bit better idea on what the actual, say, consumption constraints are for those particular technologies in the moment, instead of thinking like on a global sort of toy model scale. If we could use all the land everywhere at all the time, what might we do? I don't know if that answers your question at all, but that's sort of, I guess, how I'm thinking about next steps, is just breaking down the electric sector itself and then moving forward from there. It would be, and there are some people who have begun, I think, to toy with models to try to identify when, say, like someone turns on a stove relative to a electric dryer in their home. But I think that's still a bit of a ways out from being incorporated at a national or a global scale. Thank you for your question, Johnny.
Thanks.
I just have a quick follow-up. Thinking about hydropower and how that fits in to how you're thinking about it. Also, because we have out here, we have people taking down dams and the like, but I'm just wondering how hydropower is part of that system of thought.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, hydropower, because, by the way, the question was, how do I think about hydropower, or how does it fit in? Hydropower is incredibly important to this, but hydroelectric power is, in most places where it's feasible to do it on large scales, is kind of already tapped. So unless we get into kind of novel technologies that aren't seriously being deployed yet, right, like kinetic energy collected from waves on the ocean or something like that, there's not a lot of more space to maneuver in that dimension, which is why I didn't include it in the talk, essentially. And same with geothermal, because we can't make a ton of decisions about that technology. We're either fortunate enough to have it or not, right? And I sort of toyed with the idea of like, well, I could stack all the different power densities on top of each other, but I feel like wind or solar, excuse me, is far and away the renewable infrastructure with the highest power density. So if that is doing okay, then I thought, well, why stack on, say, like oil or natural gas or geothermal or nuclear, which is about 2 orders of magnitude larger than the power density of solar.
Continuing the questions online.
Hi, so wonderful talk as always. I wanted to kind of maybe turn to, I think, somewhat of Kyle's point earlier. I think at one point you suggested that conversions to higher densities occur because of necessity. You're talking about comparisons between different countries, Singapore, smaller countries by the very fact that they are smaller and to achieve these kinds of densities. And I'm just curious about what you think are the motivations that would force these kinds of shifts to occur, when it will become necessary to make these transformations to these technologies, and what motivates that. So I'm interested in how that kind of figures into what you think we might speculate on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several different sort of pathways that we can see this like power density being driven up, right? One is that we can see population grow. And as that happens, as a matter of course, we're likely to see electric demand increase, right? And this is why I tried to come up with this measure to account for population growth in this instance. Another, right, is a much harder issue to deal with, which is sort of like behavioral cultural change and the adoption of new technologies, which many of you have talked about today, right? So perhaps there's a new fad in Singapore. In the case of Singapore, I think it's easy to sort of explain that as a result of its investment in its key industry, right, which is semiconductor production, and that's incredibly energy intensive. So Malta, I don't know, I'm still noodling a bit over that one. If people have ideas, let me know. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Our external affiliates just moved to Malta, so we could ask.
Oh yeah.
You talked a bit about the policy changes that we're facing. Can you maybe think about that out loud?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't tell anyone else. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, I'm recording. No, so this really is something I started thinking about specifically aimed towards the investment dollars of the Inflation Reduction Act that several of the papers that I discussed in the beginning were talking about. And that's kind of a moot point, right? So for a while, there was a moment where it became very important to ask, where's the best place to locate these new technologies, right? How can we avoid, say, harming communities that have historically been marginalized and been run over by infrastructure deployments, while also doing our best to ensure that the technologies are useful where they're deployed, and that hopefully, like part of the Justice Authority initiative with the IRA, that we actually see that 40% of benefits returned to these communities that have been harmed in the past. But this is not something that is happening any longer, right? And so this sort of changes the logic of, for me, I think a study like this, where it becomes much more now in a political context like we're in today, a question of what is the benefit of deploying solar at all, rather than where do we deploy it and what's the limitations of using that relative to another renewable energy, right? Or how do we get the renewable energy mixture just right? Right now we're kind of back to, we should be doing this. Yeah, great question.
We have about 3 minutes, so maybe one more question before we wrap up. What do you want to do next? Where are you going to take us from here?
This paper. As I'm really struggling with the Inflation Reduction Act bit, because this is sort of how I had framed and developed this in my mind largely. I still think the next place that I would like to go with this is to build it out, to think about energy demand more broadly. This gets a lot trickier, right? It's a lot simpler just to think about electricity consumption than energy consumption, because electricity consumption is bounded pretty well by region, but energy can travel easily very far. And so you have to take into account many more dynamics of international trade, like imports and exports. And I would like to get into that.
Thank you so much. Should we wrap up? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your attention and questions. Oh, thank you.
We were trying to use this mic so that people online could
Could
hear better,
Yeah,
but I don't
and I
think it
forgot
was.
it. Oh, no,
It's
I,
Zoom. I think that this mic, like this is actually connected online and